But the Clean Water Act, I did ocean dumping, but the Clean Water Act was, I think, most of the managers I worked with liked that the best. Part of it was that you could relate to the resource. You could stand by a river or a stream or an estuary, and you could say, I know what I'm doing, and I know why I'm doing it. But also the structure of the Clean Water Act allowed us to do some things that are much more difficult under some of our other laws. It might be, some people wouldn't think it's a virtue, but I found the flexibility in that law and our ability to move among requirements based on technology and requirements based on water quality, that is geographic specific requirements. I found it as an administrator to be really an interesting statute to administer, and it also gave you the opportunity to do some very interesting local things. If the national standards, water quality standards didn't fit, for example, then you could work on site-specific applications, and we had methods to do it, and it was pretty exciting. I'd say the big frustration has been seeing how we've not been able to deal, and this is kind of the last point I make, we haven't been able to deal as effectively as we needed to with the land use dimension. That what happens to water is what happens on the land. And because of the way our political structure is set up, that's a particularly difficult issue for us. And so that our remaining serious pollution problems almost always have something to do with how land is managed. And we haven't worked our way through it. So even though the last Water Quality Act is 25 years old, this is a vibrant, living statute from my perspective, and we've got a lot to do. Are we up there?
We will be in just a minute. Okay. It's the other one.
And you can move right past Columbus to my second slide when we get there. As I said,
I would tease you and say that you were there when when they did my retirement party, when I retired in 2007, they didn't take it all the way back to Columbus, but they did take it all the way back to Jefferson. And it was true, I had the unique luck. It was just, dumb luck right out of college. It was just dumb luck to walk into the Federal Water Pollution Control Program in 1966 when this whole thing was building. And so, and to work with some of the visionary guys, they were all guys then, of course, to work with some of the visionary guys that really created the Clean Water Program was such an honor. It was just dumb luck, just one of those things. And so I am a living fossil of the Clean Water Program because of that, as you will find out in a minute. Have we got it? Go to the next slide. The Federal Water Pollution Control Program began in the late 40s as part of the Public Health Service. We were just a bureau in the U.S. Public Health Service. There were some earlier federal laws. For example, in 1899, the Refuse Act, which was part of the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Appropriation Bill, said, outlawed refuse dumping, but that was mostly to protect navigation. There was an Oil Pollution Act in 1924 that said, ships shouldn't discharge oil in the navigable waters of the United States right off the ship. But it took until 1948 for the Congress, and strongly supported by the Truman administration after World War II, to enact the first Federal Water Pollution Control Act. According to the report that then accompanied Senate Bill 418, polluted waters menace the public health through contamination of water and food supplies, destroy fish and game life, and rob us of other benefits of our natural resources. So the law has been amended many times since then, but the 1972 Clean Water Act, whose 40th anniversary we are celebrating this year, it was the most comprehensive and innovative of all these laws. Slide 3. The 48 Act emphasized that water pollution control was the primary responsibility of the states. This was in keeping with the general sort of constitutional notion that public health was a state responsibility. Interstate agreements were encouraged, but they weren't required. The federal role emphasized research and giving state programs support.
both through technical services and money. The law declared pollution of interstate waters to be a public nuisance which could be abated through a federal enforcement action, but only if the pollution endangered a downstream state, and only if the state where the pollution occurred agreed to a federal enforcement action. So you can imagine not a whole lot of those federal enforcement actions moved forward. To control wastewater from towns and cities, of course, was very expensive, and it was beyond the will or capacity of most localities. State aid was very rare. So congressional support started to build for a federal program of construction grants that would help localities build sewers and sewage treatment works. So the first federal construction grants program, this is to help cities and localities build sewage treatment works, was enacted in 1956 over President Eisenhower's veto. This determination of Congress to provide money for municipalities to clean up their wastewater problems, only to be vetoed by a president who was then voted into, these laws voted into enactment by the Congress over the president's veto, actually was a pattern that repeated 3 times. So 1956, President Eisenhower, then in 1972, that law was vetoed by President Nixon, passed virtually unanimous over his veto, and then the creation of the State Revolving Loan Fund program in the 1987 Water Quality Act was vetoed by President Reagan and passed by Congress over the president's veto. So there's been this dynamic for a very, very long time about how much federal money should be provided to localities. But by the 1960s, water pollution control was seen increasingly as an environmental, nature conservation problem, and not overwhelmingly just a public health problem. The level of pollution was becoming intolerable, and politicians, and this is an economic argument, politicians in the heavily industrialized Northeast and Midwest worried that southern and southwestern states would attract their industry in part by offering the assimilative capacity of their rivers. So both on an economic side and on the environmental side, pressure is building for stronger federal authority. Now the 1965, next slide, Water Quality Act, that was the law that gave me a job. It set the stage for the 72 law in a number of ways. The 65 law demanded creation of a new agency specifically devoted to water pollution control, take it out of the Public Health Service. A key new feature was that states were to establish water quality standards for all interstate waters. The James, for example, was an interstate water, and one of my little jobs as a little bureaucrat was to trace, that little creek that crossed from West Virginia over into Virginia to prove that federal water quality standards had to be set for the James River as well. The states set the standards, but they were subject to approval by the federal government. The new federal agency issued policy principles that would greatly influence how the 1972 law turned out. But in those days, before having a lot of federal regulations, our policy principles were in a trifold. It was amazing. I look at them sometimes. That's what we had. One of them, for example, was states were asked to establish and enforce requirements for a minimum level of a treatment. In other words, the idea was water quality standards were a great thing to have. They told you what you wanted to protect water uses and what you needed to accomplish. But engineers needed something a little bit more practical than that. So federal policy encouraged secondary treatment of municipal wastewater, generally 85% removal of biological oxygen demand, or if you really want to be technical about it, biochemical oxygen demand, and also suspended solids. And in those days, and perhaps still, that was considered to be the sign of a well-operated sewage treatment plant. The federal policy asked that the equivalent of secondary treatment, whatever that meant, be sought for industrial discharges. So this was the beginning of the notion that there would be 2 tracks, a minimum technology track, and a water quality geographic track. The principle was established that water's cleaner than the minimum water quality standards, should be protected at that higher quality. Also, to define the equivalent of secondary treatment, our little federal agency started to develop effluent limitation guidelines for categories of industry. Next slide. But the implementation of pollution controls at all levels was still very slow, and of course there was a lot of resistance by cities and industries to pollution cleanup, at least to the level of secondary treatment. Trying to enforce water quality standards got bogged down by arguments over the science and also the cost. The federal agency, we would hold enforcement conferences trying to bring everybody together, but the powers were very limited for these enforcement conferences, and the process very cumbersome and very slow. Another serious factor was that industry opposition helped to block our efforts at the federal level to develop a database of industrial effluents. The then President's Bureau of the Budget used its powers to control information collection to prevent the Department of Interior, the responsible federal agency at the time, from doing industrial effluent surveys. So both we and the public lacked the information we needed to really set good treatment requirements. Finally, study after study showed that if you really wanted to achieve secondary treatment nationwide in cities, it was going to cost a whole lot and require a lot of financial assistance. So, next slide. The law required the states to submit all these standards and requirements to the federal government by mid-1967, but 5 years later in 1972, it was clear that this whole process, even with federal assistance, wasn't forceful enough to prevent serious water pollution problems. A really startling event, which is the next slide, was that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire from oily discharges, and that wasn't the first time. It repeatedly caught on fire. I think they were just as worried about the danger for the wooden bridges, but a river on fire. They had a very large oil spill near Santa Barbara, not the first oil spill, but an oil spill that was infamous and got a lot of attention and probably spurred the first Earth Day in 1970. Closer to home, the Potomac River was considered by many people to be hazardous. Next slide. So the 1972 amendments, and excuse me for taking this long to get to 72, but actually we're almost home now. The 72 law, the Clean Water Act, whose 40th anniversary we're now celebrating, completely reorganized all the existing federal statutes, and it established federal jurisdiction over all waters in the United States, intrastate as well as interstate. It set an absolutely visionary and breathtaking vision for those of us who loved clean water. That is to restore and maintain the chemical, the physical, and the biological integrity of all the nation's waters, a huge goal. This intent went far beyond public health and pollution control to protection of all water uses and all habitat essential for healthy aquatic life. Strikingly, that law became, the act became law despite serious contention, again, between the Congress and the White House. There were serious economic principles at stake as well. Congress wanted consistency in pollution control requirements from state to state. It did not want strong state programs undermined by areas that might try to attract industry by offering pollution havens. Congress reinforced the policy, which was in that little trifold, if you will, that no one has a right to pollute. It wanted to reward and protect good industrial actors by making the economic playing field more level. And in particular, this was implemented by changing those effluent limitation guidance documents that we had started to develop into binding national regulations. Congress refined those regulations, requirements just a little bit in 1977, especially for regulation of toxic pollutants, but basically the regulatory scheme of the 72 law is still mostly in effect. A totally new regulatory partnership between the federal government and the states was the creation of the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System.
Even after 40 years, that does not blow off the tongue. So if you hear me use an acronym NPDES, it's because it's easier. This was I want to stress, this was an extremely novel way to extend federal authority. Because what they said was, yes, there will be a federal permit program, national regulations, national effluent limitation guidelines. However, if the states adopt laws and regulations that bring their programs to this level, or they maintain strong programs at this level, they can qualify to take over the administration of this federal program. And indeed today, most states administer the federal NPDES program. Next slide. The Clean Water Act allowed, I'm sorry, you need to go one more. Okay. One of the really important things about the Clean Water Act was that it let citizens into environmental decision making in a way they had never been. In public notice and requirement on all individual permits, so those who wanted to know could find out what was happening right here in Charlottesville or wherever. Information about permit violations was also public. But a critical aspect was to provide for the first time a nationwide database of pollutants, pollutant discharge data, exactly what was coming out of facilities. This was now public information, not only available to the government, but available to everybody. This, by the way, was part of a broad government in the sunshine era, which included, for example, the Freedom of Information Act, and also the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. To protect the functioning of sewage treatment plants, since most industries actually discharge to sewage treatment plants rather than directly to waters, a program was set in place to regulate the harmful discharges going into sewage treatment plants, which sort of made people running sewage treatment plants with industrial contributors into another platoon of water pollution enforcers. This was a little hard to take for a while, but eventually it really started to work out. Now, the Clean Water Act and the permitting program, its immediate priority was enforcing those minimum treatment requirements, the secondary treatment for municipalities and the industrial effluent guidelines for industry. So water quality standards were neglected, but gradually during the mid-'80s, we started to have to repolish the water quality tools for those areas where more than minimum treatment was going to be necessary. This, in the fullness of time, evolved into total maximum daily loads, which I understand is a topic of conversation right here in River City, and Robbie, thank God Robbie is going to talk about that. I'm going to stay up at the 30,000 foot level. Next slide, just to say that obviously the Clean Water Act provided a very generous amount of funding for its time for municipal sewage treatment works. The authorization was $5 billion annually. And while we had enforcement tools, as one of our really wonderful former administrators, Russell Train, who recently died, used to say, it takes some sugar to make the pill go down. And so the federal funding for municipal wastewater treatment was really, really fundamental to the cleanup we have today. In 1987, Congress turned that into a revolving loan fund program to make it sustainable for the long run. And by golly, it's still in effect today. What the new law did not regulate, next slide, was non-point sources. That is, runoff or diffuse sources of no discernible origin. Now, if NPDES is not very easy to roll off the tongue, the non-point source distinction made in the Clean Water Act, which is now sort of passed into our ordinary language, I don't think you could find more awkward terminology than that. Non-point sources, as you know, cover a very vast, wide array of activities. And in fact, the distinction is a bit fuzzy because some former non-point sources, such as small animal feeding operations and small urban stormwater programs, can become point sources if they're causing violations of water quality standards and are designated sort of on an individual basis by the state or by EPA. The 1972 law did provide some pretty generous funding at first for water quality management programs, or so-called area-wide planning programs at the state and local level, and the hope was that would really take care of a lot of the non-point source governance. But gradually the 208 funding dried up. In the 1987 law, Congress authorized a new program, Section 319, to fund state non-point source pollution control activities, and much of the Section 319 money could come to a state, but then go out in some grant funding to local activities. However, again, given the thousands, the myriads of kinds of causes of non-point source problems, this was literally a drop in the bucket. Farmers can receive some federal funds from the Farm Bill conservation programs, and I'm glad Tom is here to talk about that. Last slide, just to say even though the last major amendments of the Clean Water Act were passed in 1987, this law is still a vibrant living statute, and we have got a lot of work to do. The important part of the work I think we have to do is in the area which I'd say the interface between land management and water pollution control. What happens on the land happens in the water. This is a huge unfinished agenda, and it's an agenda that involves every citizen that cares about clean water, every citizen that has a lawn, every citizen that uses water, every farmer, every forester, in fact, I'd say about everybody in the United States. And of course, mobilizing that kind of activity the right way to maintain the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters is a huge job and is part of what we're all about. Thank you very much.